So years ago, at my previous job, I had a coworker that we had checked out cars sometimes. He did a lot of driving for the company, so he had a university vehicle. On the side of it, it had a big UW logo for the University of Wyoming. And he was the kind of guy that sometimes would rub people the wrong way. He had a very interesting attitude at times. He liked to kind of stir things up, and that was just his way. Sometimes it was for better. Sometimes, maybe it didn't come across so well. But that kind of personality sometimes causes people to go after you. But in Laramie, the small town that we were from, the downtown, there are a lot of bars or saloons. There are a lot of other places, but you could pretty much go any one of the blocks and there was a bar somewhere. But that meant if you went to another business, you'd probably park just somewhere and there'd be a bar close by. And at one point, he had his checked out car and somebody saw him parking, going into some business, but that person then complained to somebody at the university about, did you see him? He was parking by a bar. And of course, then the claim is that now on the books of the University of Wyoming, you cannot park one of the university vehicles near or at a bar. Now, my coworker said that was because of me. That I did that. I was the one that parked there, and that's on the books because of me. And he was proud of it because that's the kind of guy he was. So, if I ever got a university vehicle, I had to be careful where I parked because according to the university regulations, you could be on the same block, but that wasn't allowed. You could be going into some other business, but they're looking out for their reputation as a university. You understand it, but it comes down to sometimes, somebody's out there going to be saying, now we just can't have nice things because of you. It's your fault that we have to have this. And you kind of think, are there laws and rules because of what we ourselves have done? Is there something in the books because maybe our actions or our attitude have done something? Now, I don't think there's something in like the rule books of Michigan or Wyoming where I'm from that says, because Stanley did this, now you can't do this. Not that I know of. But as you go through the Bible, there are moments where we read a law or a statute where you have to step back and think, who did what in order to have this specifically stated in the Bible? There's an old quote, this is probably from about the 1st century AD by somebody named Cornelius Tacitus, and he said, the more corrupt the state, the more numerous the laws. Now, his statement was probably being said more about the government and the way they pile on more rules and laws to control their citizens, but I would also say the fact is also true about the citizens in any place. Because you step back and think, who needs more laws and rules? Would it be a group of people who are well behaved, that control their own thoughts and ideas, who govern themselves, or the people that are unruly? Are those the type of people that need things spelled out? Why do things have to be spelled out in so much detail for some people? Why do so many seemingly small things need to be specifically stated and talked about in such great detail, whether it's in the Bible or even in the laws of any kind of country or land? And we kind of have to step back and say, are we the type of people who need everything spelled out? Are we growing and learning more so we don't have to have these things spelled out? Are we instinctively knowing what's right and wrong from day to day? Especially for those instances that aren't specifically spelled out in the Bible. Do we use common wisdom from this, about 2,000-year-old book to say, I know how to deal with road rage? They didn't really have cars back when this book was written. Maybe you're walking along a Roman road and somebody in a chariot cuts you off, and you say, hey, I'm walking here, because obviously you're from Boston, in Jerusalem. But, the idea is here in this book, whether or not they had the same issue back then. Do we need a law to control road rage written in the Bible? Or is there some already knowledge bit of wisdom hidden in these pages? Are we becoming more able to take things that are spelled out in the Bible and apply it to our everyday situations? Or are we like those people in the world who need more and more do's and don'ts spelled out specifically, constantly? Can we apply God's ways effectively to new situations that we may come across? Are we making God's nature our own, or do we need more and more laws? The title for my split sermon here is, Do We Need More and More Laws? I'm going to step back and look at some humorous things here. You always see these things going around. I know These went around well before Facebook and everything like that. You get them in emails, and I think they're also written in some books. These are weird laws that are in states, and you kind of have to think, where did this come from? Who did what in order for this law to be passed in this city or this state? They're often listed as silly laws that you've come across. And what was somebody thinking in order for this have to be necessary? So South Dakota, I know a few of you have been there. Some of us went there for the feast, and I was there, and a bunch of you were there, and we didn't even know it at that time before we moved here. But South Dakota, hopefully none of you did this, but it is illegal to sleep in a cheese factory. All right. Alabama, it is illegal to wear a fake mustache that causes laughter in a church. If you've got a normal mustache, people can laugh all they want, but if it's fake, that's illegal. Now, Wyoming here, I might have violated this one myself. You may not take a picture of a rabbit from January to April without an official permit. Why? Minnesota, a person may not cross state lines with a duck atop his or her head. You can just see the state police there at the border with their guns drawn, come out with a duck off your head. North Carolina, elephants may not be used to plow cotton fields. West Virginia, whistling underwater is prohibited. I figure if you can, you should be allowed to do such things. Ohio, this is a little bit more close to home for us here. It is illegal to get a fish drunk. Was somebody trying to fish a little bit more easily and they just kind of poured their beer in, hoping that they could lure it in? Or was somebody at a restaurant and saw the aquarium and poured their vodka shots in there? Why? Why are these things on the books? Now here's one that you can understand. Wyoming. It is illegal to ski while drunk. This should follow under the category of duh. And this is the thing, when you step back from some of these things, this should fall under the category of love your neighbor, because you could get somebody killed. Massachusetts, it is illegal to own an explosive golf ball. Now, where did this come from? Was it an assassination attempt? Some high-up official, it's like, I know they play golf, so I'm going to swap this. So instead of playing, when you hit it and it's 4, this time it's C4. Boom. Was it, an assassination attempt, or was somebody trying to cheat and scare somebody? Where do these come from? Now, here's another one from Michigan. It is illegal for a woman to cut her own hair without her husband's permission. So, now, you can go get it cut somewhere else, but you can't do it yourself. So you've all been warned. Now you know. A lot of these should come down to, well, the 2 great commandments in a lot of ways. Let's look at the first one here. Turn with me to Deuteronomy 6. Some of them are just kind of silly, and maybe you kind of understand maybe something happened weird and somebody passed something, but especially this one about the exploding golf ball. That's just a bad idea. And the skiing drunk, okay, sure. Deuteronomy 6, and we'll read in verse 4 here. This is what we often term the greatest commandment. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your strength. And these words which I command to you shall be in your heart. This is the root where everything else should come from. This law and any others need to be written in our hearts, not just in a book, not in a law library where only the lawyers can read it, not just in a tablet in the school, not in the state capitol, in our hearts. It can be written all those other places, but if it's not in our hearts, if it's not internalized, then we forget. Then we need to have them constantly told to us, because we'll violate them again and again, because we'll find new and creative ways to sin. And that's human nature. Turn with me to Proverbs. And we'll read a couple quick verses there. Proverbs 7. It's stated here, Proverbs 7, verse 1, it says, My son, keep my words and treasure my commands within you. Keep my commands and live, and my laws as the apple of your eye. Bind them on your fingers, write them on the tablet of your heart. If these laws are in our minds and our hearts, then we don't have to have silly things told to us like don't make an exploding golf ball, don't get the fish drunk, don't drink and ski. These things shouldn't need to be laws if we're taking the initial thought of how do I treat people? How do I obey God? Sometimes it has to be said because we all have those moments of maybe this is a good idea. And somebody should say, maybe it shouldn't be. We all have those things because we are all definitely human. But how far down that rabbit hole do we go of thinking of new creative ways to do bad things? We all have that short-sightedness. But having a law on the books that says these things just kind of shows how far away we have gotten from what God intended for mankind. Do we think through our actions before we do the wrong things? We should be striving for that so that a law doesn't have to be written because somebody did something silly along the way. Should we step back and say, is this loving my neighbor? Let's turn to Matthew. And of course, this is where this is stated a little bit more. Matthew 22, excuse me. Matthew 22, and we'll go to verse 37 to start. The Pharisees are trying to, again, trap Jesus and get him to say things that will rile people up. And in verse 36, I'll read it here. Teacher, what is the great commandment in the law? The great commandment in the law. And he answers and says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind. I mean, this is something that they should have known. This is written well before this, a few hundred pages back here at the beginning of the book. I know they didn't have this kind of book back then, that they knew this. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Now, we can say, okay, those are the two laws. And as humans, we have to have this a little bit more spelled out. So then we have the 10 commandments, which this summarizes. But even in those 10s, there's a lot of depth. But sometimes you wonder why specific things had to be spelled out. Why reading through books like Leviticus, you think, who in their right mind did that? Why did God have Moses record this specifically? Why did Moses have to pass certain things along to the Israelites and then on to us? Well, because it's human nature. That's what we have to contend with, and that is the underlying problem through it all. We want what everybody else around us has, or we want more than we currently have. We want what we shouldn't or can't have. And Israel was always along with the lines of this same problem. You think of the things that the Israelites saw during the Exodus. The things, the miracles, the wonders. They saw a powerful nation completely brought to nothing. Its leader was destroyed in the water that they themselves had just walked through on each side of them. They walked through it safely. This nation was crushed by that same water. They walked out free as slaves. And yet throughout time, they weren't happy with what God told them, what he defined as right and wrong. They knew or should have known that God had the authority and the power to guide them, and he wanted to. But they wanted what everybody else had. And yet they needed more and more laws. And because of this, they needed more and more laws spelled out over time because they would not listen. Turn with me to 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel 8. Throughout time, they just completely forgot that God would guide them his way, but they wanted something else. 1 Samuel 8, and we'll go verse 4 and 5 here. They wanted something else. Then the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "Look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations." Now, they did have a point here. Samuel's sons were not following God just like they said. It was a problem here. They were perverting justice. But the problem was, instead of going to God and trusting that he had another way, they wanted to do it for themselves. They wanted to add on more laws, more complexities. God would have provided the proper leadership for Israel had they trusted him. But they wanted what everybody else had. They wanted that king. So God allowed it. But he told them what would happen, essentially telling them that there's essentially a natural law that will go along with this. He basically said, because you do not want to follow the laws that I've set down for you, these laws will now apply to your lives. This is how things work because you do not follow me. He goes through and says, he'll take your sons and daughters. He'll make instruments of war. He'll take your fields and your lands and your livestock. You're going to be the king's servants now. These are the laws that are going to get added onto your lives because you do not want to follow the basics that I set down for you. God warned them. And if you look in verse 18, it says, and you will cry out in that day because the king whom you have chosen for yourselves, these are the laws and rules that you have heaped on yourselves, and the Lord will not hear you in that day. That's that warning. And what did they say? They said, no, but we will have a king over us. They said, our king will fight our battles. We don't need God to do it. We'll be like the nations around us. And through their history, they did all right if that king decided to follow along with God. But then when that king was gone, they just went straight back because those rules didn't apply to them anymore. The people didn't care. The love for God goes right out the window, so why should the law about graven images matter? I can build my Dagon statues. I can do anything I want. I can sacrifice things to whatever God I decide. Coveting, that doesn't apply to me either. But then they'll also complain when things aren't going right for them and probably add on some more rules that don't really help. And that's been human nature ever since. We try to fix things. We try to add on a bandage and instead of going back to the actual root of the problem. The further we get from caring about God's fundamental commandments, the more corrupt we find our society. And then we have to define more and more, do this and don't do this. We get so far off track, it's harder and harder to get back to the true path that leads to everlasting life. As God told Samuel, he said, they have forsaken me. Humans want to figure things out for themselves. That's our nature. We want to take the most difficult route because we think we know better. Instead of basing our wisdom on understanding on a foundation that God's provided, we want to figure everything out for ourselves. We want to reinvent the wheel. We want to reinvent morality. And that leads to problems because in the long run, everybody else wants something different morally. This person wants a square wheel, this person wants a triangular wheel. That's what we all want because we know better. Some people want that exploding golf ball. Some people want to ski downhill on ice after doing vodka shots. That's the problem here. Even while God spells out what's right and wrong, or what will happen when we choose certain things, we still decide to choose poorly. We make it harder on ourselves because human nature is corrupt. We require more and more instruction because we're left to our own choices. More and more laws to spell out in more detail what to do and what not to do. Turn with me now to Leviticus 18. The heading in my Bible here for Leviticus 18 talks about the fact that this is relationships and walk of God's earthly people and unlawful marriages. And, this is all talking about personal relationships of the people and kind of spelling out a lot of what not to do. And here God's talking to Moses and telling them to pass this along. And we'll start in verse 3, Leviticus 18, verse 3. It says, according to the doings of the lands of Egypt where you dwelt, this is the stuff that they were surrounded with, you shall not do. And according to the doings of the land of Canaan where I am bringing you, same morals in both these places, essentially, that you got to be on the lookout for. You shall not do, nor shall you walk in their ordinances. So God has laws. Follow these. Learn these. Don't look to the nations around you for what they do and what they have to be dealing with. Verse 4 here, it says, you shall observe my judgments and keep my ordinances and walk in them. I am the Lord your God. And of course, he wanted to have these things written into their hearts so they didn't have to be spelled out all the time. He wanted them to learn the right and wrong. Verse 5, you shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, which If a man does, he shall live by them. I am the Lord. And then in verse 6 here it says, none of you shall approach anyone who is near of kin to him to uncover his nakedness. I am the Lord. And as you go through the rest of this chapter especially, you have to think, why did this have to be so detailed? This whole section, why did God have to be so specific? Don't sleep with this person. Don't sleep with that person. Wasn't the definition of a godly marriage kind of already taking care of this issue? But when Israel had been surrounded by an evil society, and when they're going to a place with another evil society, God had to really spell this out for them, because humans find loopholes. We say, well, it doesn't say this, so I can do it. It doesn't specifically say this, so I can do that. It said Egypt and Canaan did these types of things. This was the norm for the world that they lived in, and it's the norm for the world that we live in today, so we have to be on guard as well. In order to counter the world's corruption, sometimes it does take a lot of explanation, especially as we are beginning to learn. But our calling is to be different, so we can discern right from wrong specifically, especially when those things aren't specifically spelled out in this book verbatim. While the basic underlying sin of Leviticus 18 is just adultery and coveting mostly, each of these things were still spelled out for Israel, saying, do not do this, because people find a way around it. But as we grow in wisdom and knowledge led by God, we should be able to extrapolate on these things that are not specifically spelled out in these pages. Otherwise, this book would be a lot longer. It's pretty thick as it is. It's not a quick read. But think of all the things that God could put in this book. Say, don't do this. Don't make exploding golf balls. Don't drive drunk. Don't use your chariot drunk. I guess that would have been more in the time of this. But that's all summed up in other commandments that God says, and we have to learn that way. We have new ways to kill people now. Do we need a verse in here that says, don't drop a nuclear bomb on your neighbor? That didn't exist back then. But it seems like as humans, we have to have that kind of thing spelled out. But because we are learning God's nature, we have to make it part of us. Is that what we do day to day, coming from a pure heart? Start turning with me, please, to 1 Timothy. If we have a pure heart and we're willing to follow God, we don't have to have every single little thing spelled out, because we know what God intends. He knows what he wants from us, and we're thinking about it, meditating about it. 1 Timothy 1, and we'll start in verse 5 here. Now the purpose of the commandment is love from a pure heart, from a good conscience and sincere faith. This is where we need to be in our walk towards the kingdom. From which some, having strayed, have turned aside to idle talk. These are the people that need more things spelled out for them. They constantly are finding a loophole. They're finding a new path, and it's harder and harder to get back the further you go. It says in verse 7, desiring to be teachers of the law, understanding neither what they say nor the things which they affirm. But we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully. Knowing this, that the law is not made for a righteous person, but for the lawless and insubordinate, for the ungodly, and for sinners, and for the unholy and profane, for murderers of fathers and murderers of mothers, for manslayers. Murder is murder, right? Why does it have to spell out murderers of fathers, mothers, manslayers? It's all murder, right? But God has to spell things out for us if we're not following him. Today's society, we have different levels of murder. If you do this, you might go to prison for longer. This punishment might be different because murder's not bad enough to deter us. Well, if I make this kind of murder a little bit harder to get away with, people will stop. But it doesn't stop us. We find a different way around it. What if people just didn't murder anybody anymore because it was wrong? That's what God is hoping for from us. God said, don't kill. He shouldn't have to say, don't kill babies, don't kill the elderly, don't kill the stranger, don't kill your brother. But unfortunately, humans have to have that spelled out so many times. These are all covered by love God and love your neighbor, and do not kill. But because of our own desires and Satan's influence, our societies have more and more laws to act as deterrents, because we will not follow the basic laws that God has set up for us. But even here in the Bible, as I've said, why are so many things spelled out in the Bible again? This happens in societies throughout time and even in our own nation. But even in the Bible, we talked about that bit through Leviticus, everything's spelled out. Well, it's because the carnal mind needs things spelled out. We need to be warned specifically sometimes, and sometimes somewhere along the line, somebody has thought, I'm going to try this. There's nothing new under the sun, and humans just find different ways to commit the same sins over and over in creative ways. Turn with me to Mark 10. Mark 10, and we'll start in verse 2. Yes. Here the Pharisees, again, are trying to trip him up, trying to get the answer they want. Mark 10 and verse 2, it says, the Pharisees came and asked him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Testing him. They should have known the answer for this, but they wanted their own answer. And he answered and said to them, what did Moses command you? They said, Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and to dismiss her. Well, yeah, that was a correct answer, but it wasn't the full answer for why or whether or not a man should divorce his wife. And it goes on here to say, and Jesus answered them and said, because of the hardness of your heart, he wrote you this precept. That sums up a lot of precepts in the Bible, because of the hardness of our hearts. That's why God has to spell out, don't do this, don't do that. Do this, don't do that. And he keeps on going, but from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. This was the intention. For this reason, man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate. That key of because of the hardness of our hearts, that's why so many things have to be spelled out constantly for humans. So much detail, because if not, we tend to reason for ourselves. It's not enough to say, does it hurt someone or don't hurt someone? You have to spell out how not to hurt someone. If you say, don't hurt someone or don't punch someone, well, I'm going to slap them. It's not punching. Well, no, don't slap them. Well, I'm going to kick them. Well, no, don't do that either. Well, I'm going to hit them with my car. You do not hurt them. Can I hire somebody else to do it? That's how our minds go if we let it. We always find a way around the law when we think there's a loophole because of the hardness of our hearts. We don't really want to follow in the first place. We want to find our own path. And that leads to more and more laws, more specifically spelled out rules, because we as humans don't have God's laws written in our hearts in the first place. It's not our nature. But we do have the ability to be different because of God's Spirit. We can ask for them to be written in us, internalized. King David asked for this specifically in Psalm 51. He says, create in me a clean heart. Give me something pure that can be worked with, a heart of flesh, not a stubborn heart. A heart of stone will budge, but a heart of flesh will. If we have God's Spirit working in us, we will know better when things are right and when they're wrong. We won't have every detail spelled out constantly because we'll know. We'll have meditated on God's way and we'll be prepared when things come along. We'll think things through before we act. Our conscience will be set on doing what's right and will warn us when we might be straying. God won't need to make a new law or precept specifically because of us. You won't have a prophet that comes in and says, well, Stan was out there getting fish drunk, and then so everybody take out your books. Here's a new law because of Stan. We don't have to do that because, hopefully I thought it through before I did that. And turn with me to Ezekiel 11. And we can see a time where this will be more pronounced. More people will be able to do this because the Spirit will be working in more people. Ezekiel 11 and verse 19. Then I will give them one heart, and I will put a new spirit within them, and take the stony heart out of their flesh, They're not going to have that hardness. They're not going to be looking for loopholes. They're not going to say, well, what about this? Well, what about that? And if they do ask, it will be for the right reasons. They won't be looking to get by a law or rule. They'll be legitimately wanting to do what's right, not find a loophole like the Pharisees were doing. They said, is divorce okay? Because they wanted it to be okay. They weren't trying to make sure that they were on the right path. They wanted to make their own rules. And give them a heart of flesh, one that will follow more instinctively, because we are willing to follow God. And it says in verse 20, that they may walk in my statutes and keep my judgments and do them, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God. Now, of course, this is talking about Israel in the future, but this is what we have to be happening in our lives as Christians right now. We must be working to get rid of that heart of stone now. But even as we look through the whole Bible, it is what God wanted from the very beginning. If you want to turn back to Deuteronomy 4, this was right from the start. God wanted this. Of course, there's that missing dimension that makes it possible. Deuteronomy 4 and verse 5. It says, surely I've taught you statutes and judgments, just as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should act according to them in the land which you go to possess. Therefore be careful to observe them, for this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the people who will hear all these statutes and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. Wisdom is really needed for this to really sink in. What do people see when they interact with us? Do they see a person that's wise? Or do they see somebody that needs to be kept under control, that needs more, do this and don't do this, constantly told to them? For what great nation is there that has God so near to it, as the Lord our God is to us, for whatever reason we may call upon him? And what great nation is there that has such statutes and righteous judgments as are in this law, which I set before you this day? In verse 9 it says, only take heed to yourself and diligently keep them yourself, lest you forget these things your eyes have seen, unless they depart from your heart all the days of your life. He really wanted these to be in their hearts from the beginning, so he didn't have to spell out all these other small things. And then we have to teach them to your children and your grandchildren. When these depart from our hearts, no amount of legislation can keep us in check. When we don't want to follow it, another rule on the books will not get us back on path if that's not where we want to be. So are we developing wisdom to follow God's laws? There's another silly law out there. In Georgia, it is illegal to keep an ice cream cone in your back pocket on Sundays. You can do it on Saturday. Why you'd want to have an ice cream cone in your back pocket or any pocket is well beyond me. This may not play into morals, but your mom's going to be annoyed with you when you have a stain on the back of your pants with ice cream, and then you sit down and somebody else has got to clean this up. So think things through. But let's turn to 1 Corinthians and read a little bit more about how we need to do this so we ourselves are not needing to be told, do this, don't do this constantly, because we're thinking it through. We have discerning attitudes and minds. 1 Corinthians 11, verse 31. It says, for if we would judge ourselves, that's take the time to think before we do something, discern if it's right from wrong before we do something based on what God's already told, we would not be judged. Paul didn't need to write this thing to them. He shouldn't have had to write this whole book. This was a problem that should have been solved by following the commandments. But unfortunately, there were problems, and he had to write this letter to them. In verse 32, but when we are judged, we are chastened by the Lord, that we may not be condemned with the world. Hopefully when we are corrected, we learn and we grow so that we, in the future, don't need more and more and more things spelled out. We don't need more laws on the books. Are we the type of person who needs more things spelled out constantly because we're unwilling to apply the things that are already straightforward? Or do we need fewer and fewer specifics because we've learned to discipline ourselves properly, to discern right from wrong using the wisdom and understanding that we can glean from these books? Can God trust us to do what's right, typically? Or do we need constant direction even in the smallest of matters? When faced with a situation that is seemingly unique, can we step back and say, is this showing love for God or my neighbor? How do I approach this in a godly way? As we grow as Christians, we must be growing in wisdom and using the heart of flesh that has internalized God's nature. If we are to be given the same glory and power as everyone else in God's family, we need to be trusted with it, to know right from wrong, to inherently understand good from evil, and to do what's right all the time. Understanding these basic two commandments, love God and love your neighbor, are not simple things in life. It takes a lifetime to learn it. They are complex. They need lots of wisdom and understanding to apply them correctly. Over time, we should be needing fewer and fewer new specifics because we should be making it our nature and not second nature. It has to be our primary nature. Knowing right from wrong, even for those things that are not specifically spelled out in this book. Taking what is written, what is known, and deducing should be something that we do from day to day. And that's how we learn to act. So, brethren, as we learn daily how to become more like God in Jesus Christ, we should be needing fewer do's and don'ts because we are becoming more like Jesus Christ by learning what's in this book.